changes forever. Man, think about that for a minute. Now, before we get there, we still have a trek to go. I'm very, very appreciative of the fact that we have our dear friend Pastor Lincoln Steed with us, and I have told him that in the afternoon I want all the floodgates open. He did not know this, but we live streamed his first service. First sermon, he didn't know. Purposely, I did not tell him. So he would just speak. After being 20 years editor of Liberty Magazine, you tend to learn to bridle some of the effusiveness and things you want to say, because it's just part of, I guess, the territory. We're just going to let him cut loose this afternoon. I am excited that he's here, that he's accepted the invitation. I'm excited that we can ask questions, and I want to encourage you, do not let any rock unturned when it comes to your questions on where we are, when it comes to our prophetic heritage, so to speak, or our journey, and what has to do with religious liberty and what we're living today. So with no further ado, please welcome our friend. Thank you again.
Thank you for coming back so quickly after such good food. I talk a lot on religious liberty, and I don't think I'm a talker. I never used to be. But I realized that something had changed, perhaps in me, certainly in the material. A few years ago, American Cassette Ministries, that's changed to something else now, because cassettes are gone. They asked me to do 5 one-hour programs on religious liberty in one day. And I'm thinking, man, how will I survive that? Where will I get the material? And we did it, and it was very tiring. But once it was over, I realized I really hardly had gotten into all the material, all the facets of religious liberty and current events and issues at play. So it's going to be the case here. I'll just pick up at a point that's of interest to me, and then in the question and answer, we can find out what aspects are interesting to you. There's no question we live in an atypical age, an age that even for those that maybe are not Christian or understand Bible prophecy, they know this is not typical, and arguably could be the end of the age. I remember when I was reading literary criticism years and years ago at Andrews University, it really struck me in one book. They said that this is an interesting period because we're at the hinge point between modern civilization and what is yet to come. We clearly are at a transition point. I remember in 2001, 9/11, we were all shaken. And shortly after, I read in one of the magazines that I get a quote from a magazine in France. I didn't read it in French, but Le Monde is one of the main magazines in France. And the author, a social scientist, wrote this. He said, "We have reached the point when the idea of freedom and liberty, itself a very new term, is in the process of fading and being replaced in the general consciousness by its absolute opposite, that of a tyranny of security." And if you think about it, that explains an awful lot of what's happened since. And of course, that meshes very well with what we know will happen in this country. Back at in the early days of our church, when Alonzo T. Jones was the editor of what turned out to be later Liberty Magazine, it was called The Sentinel, or The Sentinel of Liberty, when he edited it. And he was the closest thing to a protege of Ellen White. He was a young guy in his 20s who came out of the US military, lots of energy and impetuous, and Ellen White pretty much took him under her wing and tried to control him, well, not control him, direct him. You can read Adventist history and you'll find this out. She was always very supportive of him, and the White estate have, among many other things, they have a roughly bound collection of just typewritten material, some of which is in published books, but typewritten stuff relating to religious liberty, and it includes a number of letters between Ellen White and the church leadership regarding religious liberty and mentioning Jones. And in one of them, I think it's the president of the General Conference says bitterly to Ellen White, "You always take E.T. Jones's side." It was when he was opposing the gift of land to our South African, I don't know if it was a union back then, but Cecil Rhodes, a freebooter, a murderer, and a rough businessman, was trying to gain legitimacy as South Africa came under Crown rule, and he was giving money freely to the different churches. And A.T. Jones said we should never take it. And in the end, they convinced Ellen White by saying we can provide employment for the natives in the area. What they should have told her, but they chose not to, was that the reason those locals needed work was that they'd been dispossessed by Cecil Rhodes. So Jones was right. But another time, just before the 1888 General Conference session, they had a meeting to discuss the prophetic issues, and Uriah Smith got up and expounded on the meaning of the 10 toes. What were the tribes, Germanic tribes or the pagan tribes that made up the modern nations of Europe? That was very important to early Adventists, and he struggled with it a bit. And then A.T. Jones, sitting next to Ellen White, leapt up and he says, "Brother Smith may not know who the 10 toes are, but I do." And Ellen White says, "Easy, Brother Jones, easy, Brother Jones." So, that was the human side of it. But as you might or might not know, people aren't all fixated on the same things. A lot of the buzz about early Adventist history comes from this time period and the events at the 1888 General Conference session and follow-up events. At least in Australia when I was there in the 70s, people were buzzing with righteousness by faith and what A.T. Jones and his co-editor had presented. And I want to tell you, it's mostly a storm in a teacup, but at the same time vital what went on. Because the backstory to 1888 is that A.T. Jones, editing the Religious Liberty Journal, very aggressive about Adventist prophecy and growing the church, and he was one of the top leaders. In fact, the only person I know that had been, by the time he finished, editor of the Religious Liberty Journal, editor of the Review, with Uriah Smith as his associate editor, and then was editor of the Signs, and then but later in life was president of the California Conference, which was the entire west of the US for the church. A.T. Jones was concerned about fulfilling prophecy in the United States. He raised a big fuss at the Chicago World's Fair when Congress passed a resolution that there be not any work done on the Lord's Day, on Sunday. And he saw that as a fulfillment of this country upholding the wrong day. But then later, in 1888, there was a concerted effort by a senator in the US Senate that was supported well by the other legislators and, more importantly, supported by most of the major churches and civic organizations in the US to bring in a national Sunday law. And you can go online and dig up the text of it, and it's quite shocking because it's unambiguous. It says, under pain of law, you're to cease from all activity on Sunday, and you're to attend church. And made a few exceptions for emergencies, medical emergencies, and so on. And A.T. Jones appeared before Congress, gave strong testimony, and in 1888, I'm not sure at that point if the bill had been defeated by then, but it was still a very hot issue. It was defeated, obviously, but I think providentially, because the weight of religious and citizen support was overwhelming for it. And A.T. Jones, with that in mind, stood up at the General Conference. He was one of the featured speakers and spoke powerfully for the need for revival. And the people that are hung up on this and think there was some secret message there don't seem to notice that he was the main speaker at the next 2 General Conference sessions, where he continued to call for revival. And to me, it's abundantly plain what was going on. As today, with the crisis looming, he looked around at his few fellow Adventists, there were only about 25,000 at that time, and he saw them squabbling over this, that, and the other. They weren't fighting at that time on women's ordination, but things that were just as divisive. And he didn't see that they were particularly spiritually prepared. So he attacked it the right way, I think, calling for increased dedication and an understanding of what God wants to accomplish in our lives in preparation for a loud cry and then the return of Christ and a life forever with him. It was a biblically based call for revival, which Ellen White supported, never wavered. And I'm more and more convinced that today our church is in the same dynamic. It's one thing to say we're not political, and I was trying to answer earlier today a comment on that. We are very political on religious liberty. What we should never be is partisan. And I even hear politicians in Washington say, I'm not being political on this. They can't help being political. They mean non-partisan. Now, I don't even want to be partisan on our own church leadership, but I must say I was very excited when Elder Ted Wilson became General Conference President because his first call was for revival. He even set up a structure at the General Conference to coordinate worldwide revival. You think it's happened? I mean, individually, maybe a number of you really have come on fire since then, but there's no question that as a whole, we haven't been stirred to our roots. It hasn't happened. And I've said a few times that the revival is dead and it died on the altar of women's ordination. Not that I'm for or against women's ordination, it's almost immaterial. But the way the argument has been carried forward has taken away spirituality. And I do believe as we move toward what is clearly a growing confrontation with those forces, as Milton says in his work, who would combine civil power and religious sensibility and enforce obedience of some type or another, we have to be spiritually prepared to know how to deal with this, because there are factions within us who like, maybe just personality-wise, we like sort of a tough approach, and let's vote all these liberals out of power, and let's re-Christianize it, get religion back into the schools, which Adventists even come at me on, and they don't understand. Would you want someone teaching your child Islam, say, in the school? Of course not. You wouldn't want them being taught Roman Catholic views. So once you empower the government to teach religion, it's the luck of the draw, perhaps. Which religion they'll teach, it's inappropriate. We don't want religion in the schools. We want it in the home and in the heart. And there's deeper reasons why our society is becoming more secular or more godless. I'm not sure it's all that secular in the US, but becoming very godless, as the Bible says, having the lot of religion but lacking the power thereof. And in fact, at one of our religious liberty events where there were many non-Adventists from around the world, I got up partly to shock them, but I believe this. I said, there is way too much religion in the world. Way too much religion. Not enough spirituality. Religion without deep personal faith and a change that we know comes with the new birth, it can easily become a pernicious force. It easily co-opts government power. But anyhow, the story of 1888 and A.T. Jones is an interesting one for our church, and I don't think it's ever quite been resolved. But it's enough to say that this was a battle for faith and for commitment, and to bring Adventists back to an understanding of where we are on this central issue. A lot of our church leaders even, I think, imagine religious liberty as sort of an insurance policy where we will defend people that have problems in the workplace, which we do. But that's not religious liberty, because as Paul says a number of times in his letters, he speaks about the gospel of liberty. And people talk about, the government can give us religious liberty. They can't give it to you. You have it. Religious liberty is what God gave to us. He set us free from the power of sin. There's an open door set before you that no man can shut. But religious liberty is exercising that freedom against all comers, whether it's prejudice in the community, government edicts or whatever, to proclaim the everlasting gospel. So religious liberty is not something we do. It's another way of looking at the very heart of what it's all about. And it will become more and more important as we get to the close of time. I couldn't help but think this morning when we were talking about the storms in the Bahamas as to how this relates to what I think is going to be the next big issue, if you like, on religious liberty. In 2015, the Pope of Rome came and spoke to Congress. Most of you probably watched it on TV, I would imagine, or bits of it. Did any of you listen to the whole speech? You might not have guessed from the speech, but it was definitely in lockstep with the document that the Pope had issued that same year called Laudato Si, Latin for Praise be to Thee. It's quite a long document, about 120 pages. And I read these documents, but I've found to my dismay very few others seem to read them. Very important document. In the beginning of this document, the Pope says, this is a document addressed not just to Catholics, not just to Christians, but to the whole world. And he says, the earth is like our sister, our younger sister, who's in distress. She's dying. And unless we help her, we will all die. He says it's a matter for all of our survival that we do something about this. Now, I know in the US at the moment, with the current political climate, the dominant political party don't believe there's such a thing as global warming. And it bothers me because I think the argument's been framed the wrong way. You could probably debate endlessly whether or not climate change is caused by man or not. I might have an opinion on it, but that's a debatable point. That's what should be debated. But anybody that's travelled, anybody that follows the news knows that the world's weather is out of whack. Has been for a few decades, and it's getting worse. And the nations of the world are already trembling with fear of what's coming on the world. And they're going to have to do extraordinary things to deal with this. And the Pope, of course, wants to be. Anyone read Malachi Martin's book years and years ago? Keys to This Blood? In that book, he said that the Pope at that time and the Soviet Union and the United States were in a three-way battle for domination, whose ideas win. And he says the Pope is determined to win. And consistent with that, this present Pope is getting ahead of the curve, I believe, and he's staking everything on ecological measures being the most important and imperative for the world. And you should read this document. You'll get an insight into some of the ways that he's suggesting that we deal with this. And there's two levels to the document. There's an argument about the environment, then there's a theological, biblical analysis of what's gone before and how we relate to this. Very early on, he says that in dealing with the world out of whack, he says we need to rediscover the rhythms inscribed in nature by the Creator. And he says, along those lines, rest on the seventh day is imperative. And he says that it's not just for man, but for animals. And he quotes the Old Testament where Israel was enjoined that they're animals and everything. And then he even gets on to, the Pope even gets on to the Jubilee principle, the rest for the land even. Everything needs to rest. It's the natural cycle. And 3 or 4 times in this exposition, he comes back strongly saying the seventh-day Sabbath must be obeyed as a survival mechanism, not just as a recommendation. We're all going to die unless we do it. It's only at the end of this long document that he says what you would expect, that in keeping the Eucharistic Sunday, we're fulfilling the seventh-day Sabbath. But it is a Sabbath document. All of the text and the logic that we have in the fullest way that we should have. The Three Angels' message links our imperative to creation. And he is linking Sabbath keeping to the creation and the Creator and custody of what we have. It's not all bad, but it's fulfilling prophecy and laying out very clearly that the environment is going to be how this enforcement comes about, the necessity of it. His predecessor in a document called, been a few weeks since I mentioned the names of these documents, Caritas et Veritatis, Charity and Truth, discussed all of the issues of the modern dislocations, financial, people movements, capital and labour issues, environment, and so on, and gave a prescription to handle it all from a religious point of view. Very interesting document, which he had given to Obama at a pivotal moment at the time of the 2008 collapse. And at the end of that document, he says, as you and I believe, but you don't necessarily think it'll happen, he says there is a need for a global authority with the power to act and to enforce. So, Adventists began with what was largely a Protestant view we inherited from Martin Luther on the pernicious view of Christianity as it had developed under the papacy, where it was an amalgam of church and state, and looking forward to where that dynamic would kick in again, even in free countries. But, it's valid for today. Adventists must understand this. I'm trying to think what others... Well, there's many, many documents. I read all of these. One that even predates that I thought was most interesting, and I've never read an article on it, I've just read the document. The Catholic Church came out with a document called Ad Tuendum Fidem, to defend the faith. It was at the time when they were having trouble with dissident Catholic theologians, so they were trying to bring them to order. And this document was along that lines, but it gave prescriptions on how to penalise them, but then it continued. There were 3 sections to it, very short document. It said, directed to Catholics, what Catholics that reject what the church is holding or hold what the church has rejected, they are to be censored by the church. Then at the end it says this: whoever holds what the magisterium of the church has rejected or rejects what it's held is to be punished with an appropriate penalty. Very interesting. That's the language of the medieval church. And it is true, if you study history, that by and large, the Christian church / Catholic Church through the Middle Ages was not the main persecutor. What they typically did was to deliver dissidents to the power of the state. And the state was supportive and would torture, kill, or whatever. The Inquisition at its height did it directly, but that was not the norm. And I believe, all taken together, where not just Rome, but these religious coalitions, and sometimes, inadvertently, some of our Adventist leaders even get enmeshed in these things. But these religious coalitions have an overarching agenda to sort of, as long as you want. I'll just tell you 2 interesting stories, again, connecting with the Catholics. A few years ago, I went along to Catholic University to an all-day seminar put on supposedly for Catholics, but obviously they didn't keep people out, I got myself invited, and I noticed there were a few Lutherans there. It was an all-day seminar on religious liberty. And I wanted to hear what they were saying about it. And we've reached the funny pass that the general leadership of the Protestant churches in the United States don't believe in separation of church and state. I'm not interpreting it. They say it flat. That separation of church and state is not in the Constitution, which we can make a pretty good argument that it is, including quoting Thomas Jefferson, whose Virginia statute was the model for it. And he said it erected a wall of separation between church and state. But the Protestant religious right don't accept that. Of course, the secularists don't accept it. A lot of the cases you read of in the media challenging religion are coming from one group, the Freedom from Religion Foundation. They don't want religion, period, anywhere in society. But ironically, the Catholic Church are the defenders of the separation of church and state, or at least the public defenders. We'll see how sincere or deep-seated that is when push comes to shove, but they're speaking well of it. So I wanted to hear what they would say. And the main speaker was Cardinal, the Cardinal of New York, having trouble with names again. Cardinal, I'll remember it in a minute. But I thought that he was going to be a pope, but he lost the last election. But he's a charismatic American church leader who's also very hardcore theologically. Cardinal Dolan's his name. I don't know why I couldn't remember it. Cardinal Dolan. Well, he got up to speak, and I'd gone with a couple of laymen, and we were sitting at a round table just beneath him, so I could see him very closely what he was saying. And he started speaking well of religious liberty and then applying their views against Obamacare, which they don't like. It restricted some of their freedom of operation with childcare and so on. And I was watching him, and he did a bit what I do. I think anyone that talks, he knew what he was saying, so he was sort of delivering it. And inside, he's having a little bit of a discussion. And then he reached the end of his statement, and there was nothing else to come. So he just sort of stood and looked at everyone, and then he said this. Remember, he's a cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church who high-ranking head of the Roman Catholic bishops at that time in the US, and noised as a possible papal contender at that time. And he said, he's talking to Catholics, he says, Catholics once would never have spoken this way about religious liberty. We once held that error has no rights. And then he finished quickly and sat down, and he comes down from the thing, sits down next to me, all happy, got it off his chest. And so I used the moment real quick to introduce myself, and I said, I'd like to invite you to a protocol lunch at our church headquarters. Would you come? And he says, yes, absolutely. He says, but you won't have the right thing for me to drink, will you? And joking. So he's telling me, I know you people. And he never came. It didn't happen because other people were greatly embarrassed by it. But anyhow, that was over. Then they reassembled after a short break for the next session, which had published titles, subject, and there were three presenters. There was a historian, a Catholic Charities person, and a Catholic theologian. And before they could begin the set program, people started calling out from the audience, what does the Cardinal mean by that statement? Most of them had never heard their historic church position. Remember, error has no rights. You don't even have a right to be wrong. So they spent the entire hour session being tutored about what he meant. That's very interesting. And what they told them is sort of what I'll tell you with a little add-on. They had to be told that the understandings that came out of Vatican II were radical. And on religious liberty, a document called The Dignity of Man, Dignitatis Humanae, had changed their view into granting what the Constitution gives, the right of you to believe what you want, to disbelieve what you want and to change your religion and so on. That's all in Dignitatis Humanae. They had to be told that their church had essentially done an about-face on the central issue of religious liberty. What they were not told, which you should know if you piece together all that you hear in the media, that within the Catholic Church there is a bitter war over the legacy of Vatican II. The previous two popes had a hand in it, but they rejected it after the fact and were trying to turn the clock back on it in many ways. This present pope, I don't think, is quite so liberal, but his style is liberal, and he's under deep attack by conservatives who believe that he's betrayed Catholicism. The Catholic Church is not that far away from repudiating some elements of Vatican II. And watch out when anything close to officially, turn their back on Dignitatis Humanae and their understandings of Vatican II. As one day they will. It's sort of an early warning approach to it, I think. But what's happening in this country? I remember 2 presidential elections ago. Actually, I can remember several, like you can. This is just an aside, but do you remember when Biden and several other Democrats, there were a whole bunch of them, but, 6 or 7 of them at the time, they ran for president and they spoke about the 7 dwarves. No one remembers that? We seem to be in history again where there's not strong leadership other than the present president popping up. It's a very dangerous path for any country when there's not obvious alternate leaders. But I remember 2 elections ago, there was a wide field, and one of the candidates was Senator Santorum. He's still around. Nice guy. I got to tell you, he's one of the strongest supporters of our church's initiative. We were a co-sponsor with a number of other religious organisations and civil rights organisations in the Workplace Religious Freedom Act, which would redress a horrible situation where if there's a legal challenge to Sabbath accommodation, we nearly always lose. You're granted it by the Constitution, but in practice, very hard to get. If right out of the gate, if your employer acknowledges it and you get the accommodation, fine. 90+% that happens. But your chances of winning if it's challenged are very small. And Santorum was one of the backers. He's a nice guy. And I remember very clearly once with James Standish, who was our legislative liaison to Congress, we were walking down Washington and we went past a bookstore just across from one of the Capitol buildings. And here's Santorum inside signing his book. And as we were just right in the door, and as he looks up, must have seen us framed, and he says, "Hi, James, how you doing?" And all the rest. Nice, easygoing fellow. And I've nothing bad to say about him, but what he said was earth-shaking because he was interviewed by the press who know and often comment admiringly on his deeply committed Roman Catholic identity. I mean, he's a hardcore, true believer in all that the church mandates and all that his faith demands, which is good. You know, he's a man of high personal principles, but clearly identified with Catholicism. And he made the comment that rattled everybody. He said, Protestantism is absent in America today. That's an interesting statement. Very true. And you can see the signs all around you. I'll give you a litmus test if you haven't noticed. From now on, when the news comes on, listen when someone's appointed to a high-ranking government position. You'll find that overwhelmingly they're either a Roman Catholic or Jesuit educated. It's not by chance. I read the Catholic material and they are saying what Santorum said. They believe that Protestantism's lost its way and that it's their right and duty and obligation as Roman Catholics to move into the breach and that they should take up leadership positions. It's not wrong. It's not a constitutional problem. If anything, it vindicates the religious plurality of America. But as Adventists, knowing prophecy, you know what it means. In the Supreme Court, overwhelming majority Roman Catholics. There's been a few changes lately. I don't think there's more than one Protestant on the Supreme Court. So the deck is stacked. But it is a problematic thing that the Protestant nature of this country has shifted in a dangerous way. Ellen White, using figurative terms, identified the horns on the lamb-like beast as republicanism, not the party, but the principle of rule by the people, and Protestantism as the two characteristics of this country. And yet one of them is shifted a little bit. The big issue that's motivated the religious right, I wish it motivated Adventists a bit more, is the anti-abortion movement. But there's a certain irony with this, because the Roman Catholics arguably started the objection to this very early on, and they have a different reason. Anyone know why Catholics are so startled about abortion? It's their theology on original sin and the immortal soul, which Protestants don't particularly have that same view. And we've seen in recent years a coming together of a coalition of Catholics and Protestants against abortion, but now that coalition is moving on to seeking direct political power and protection of Christian sensibilities. And I believe this is the moment of peril, ironically. And yet the vast majority of our Adventists in North America, I think, see this as the coming to power. This is the great moment. But think about it for a minute, and I'll quit and we'll have questions after this. Think about it for a minute. Is what we're seeing truly protecting religious liberty, which is, one way to express it, is the right of everybody to believe whatever they want or to disbelieve whatever they want and to change their religion as they want without any penalty? Is what's going on now consistent with that, or is it, as I describe it, a greater, stronger move toward religious entitlement? More prerogatives and power for a subset of the religious community. Now, at the moment, that subset might bracket you just fine. But the framers of the Constitution recognized that. I think it was Madison that said that if you can allow one sect legislative prerogatives, they'll pretty soon turn around and restrict another sect. That's just the nature of things. That's why the safety lies in keeping government out of religion. But we're way past that thing. So think on these things. It's better that, I don't tell you, or our church tell you in microcosm what's happening in each case, but you need to study the situation. We're into an entitlement era, a lot of cheap talk on religious liberty, and yet remember it goes along with perhaps you could say well-deserved marginalisation, say, of Muslims and so on. But this is the great irony. You can't afford to start restricting any religious group, no matter how ill-behaved they are. I mean, personally, if you do illegal things, the law should come after you. But you can't drive a religion out of legal protection just because you don't like what they stand for or even what they might do. It's automatic. Once you start picking and choosing, then everybody eventually will lose to some degree, a large degree. Does anyone have any questions?
You've mentioned it in your first intervention, you're mentioning it now. The brevity or the new concept of religious liberty. It's almost like a parenthesis, what you're saying. Are we to interpret then? Is it your understanding that we should interpret that the fact that this experiment of democracy here in the United States is God's gracious time period for us to get moving and get the word out, because this soon is going to go back into this tyranny of sorts when it comes to the intolerance of it?
Well, any study of history, apart from prophecy, shows that that this more liberal, for want of a better word, idea of personal freedom and religious freedom is an anomaly in human history. It hasn't existed for long, and even in the period that it's existed, it hasn't been the dominant view around the world. So yes, we are turning with some logic behind it. You know, the times are getting more fraught for governments and societies. We're turning away from these principles that have allowed people the liberty to practice a faith and even a worldview that might be at variance with someone else. And Ellen White says what we failed to do in a time of ease, we'll have to do in a time of difficulty and crisis.
So here's my real question. 20 years within the North American division, your experience, as I see it, your department...
You think we're culpable, yeah.
No, I'm sorry, your department is the core existence of why Adventism is what it is. Yet, what shifts have you seen, and this is not knocking at our church, within the North American division that may concern you?
Well, I've hinted at it. There's many wonderful people in our organisation, and many of them, I hope not most, but many, I will accept probably better Christians, better Adventists than me personally. I mean, I can't judge other people greatly, although we all do privately while we're at it. But there's no question to me that our church at the moment is turning, not against necessarily, but turning a blind eye to some key things that framed and formed it and should be our focus today. I have an example. My father, I watched that. I was an observer, so it didn't touch me directly, but he came and headed up the temperance department, which Ellen White, if you read Ellen White's biography, I think if she hadn't been prophet to the Adventist church, she'd have gone down in the history books as another Carey Nation. Anyone heard of Carey Nation during the anti-alcohol social movement in Ellen White's lifetime? Carey Nation has gone into the history books as a woman vigilante against alcohol. She used to have an axe and would go and smash the doors to the saloons down. We forget, the liquor interests have been very good after the fact in their PR. They portray the Prohibition era as against the will of the people and giving rise to the speakeasies and the bootleggers. In reality, there was a huge social move against the public drunkenness and the predatory nature of the liquor interests that were destroying society at that time. That was Ellen White's preoccupation. She says it was her favourite topic. And further, you've started me on it. There's a testimony in Temperance. I think it's page 220, the book Temperance. She says she had a dream and she saw the angel that was often in her visions. He appeared as a young man, and all the church leaders were in the open air, and she said the angel listened as they said, well, they wish they could support temperance, but, good for other people, but not for them. And she said the angel then, with a piece of paper, went around to each of them, and he says, sign this, he says, and they said, well, I can't. And he says, sign this on your life. He says, you do not see the importance of temperance, but when the plagues of God begin to fall all around you, you will then see that temperance and temperance alone is the foundation of all the virtues and the victories to be gained. That's a pretty heavy thing. No temperance department anymore. None. If you're lucky, you might find a little passing statement in the review now and then in the health section that alcohol's not good for you or tobacco or something. But we dropped it. And religious liberty was a central issue in Ellen White's day with A.T. Jones and the issues of the day. They haven't sent us home yet, but in one of the unions, they told the director in no uncertain terms they don't need him. He's retiring in a few weeks, pushed toward retirement, and they said they're not necessarily going to replace him. That is not a good sign, right? Liberty magazine is continuing unabated. We print more than most of the other in fact, I don't know any other than the giveaway of the review to every household. There's no other publication in North America at our level, but our support slowly down. I'm going to see it out, but I don't know what will happen in the future. And what I have noticed right now, this last year, our offering went down a couple of percent, not enough to threaten anything, but it's uniformly slightly down in all the North American divisions except Canada. And what I read into that is that the support is softening because within North America, the body of Adventists are super comfortable with where we are right now politically. And in Canada, which normally it's a weak giving area, but Canada's up. And I have had letters lately, and I'm sorry to give such a long answer, I've had letters lately from Adventists just really ripping into me. It's quite amazing, and I've talked to some of them. I wouldn't write it too big, but any editor takes notice of letters to the editor, positive or negative. They stand in for a lot more. And in the last couple of years, I've probably had a couple of dozen Adventists just ripping and railing at us as liberal feminists. And I know that there's a couple of things that set them off. That we argue for the humane treatment of immigrants. We're not arguing. No one in their right mind would argue to allow anyone in that wants to come illegally. But put your thinking caps on. When people are being snatched from different places, even right on the border, some of them are being shot across the border. I don't know if you've been reading carefully. There's been people killed standing on the other side of the border where they're taken and treated in internment camps where they're kept. They've got permission now to keep them indefinitely. And children are taken away. Thousands of kids have been taken away from their parents and put into adoption. Right? This is reminiscent of a darker time in US and world history. Surely this would worry you. But the people are happy about it. But we've commented on that. After one of the school shootings, there's been so many, now I even forget which one was. I had a Methodist woman from Texas write an article where she argued that there should be some sense that there are too many guns, that we need to curb our violent proclivities in the US. And we weren't arguing. The only thing she did, she quoted from a General Conference action under Neil Wilson where the church decried the use of automatic weaponry. And on that, we called liberals and feminists. I don't understand it. I mean, I understand it, but I don't think it shouldn't compute. And we all come with different biases and so on, but we really need to sort of clear the air. It's fine if we come from an area that, guns are sort of second nature or a sense of entitlement, forgetting about Indians and all the rest, but, this is our country and no one else should ever come. That might be our personal makeup, but don't mix it up with what the church stands for. There's large principles that need to supersede our own personal biases, but at the moment, they've taken a grip on at least a good cross-section of Adventists, and it really worries me. Because what's the next step that will bother you? There are detention camps all over the US. Like right now, do you know that the US has more people behind bars than any other country in the world? Right? Not that everything the US does is bad, hardly. I think you can make a pretty good case that other than Australia, this is the best country in the world. Sorry, that's... No, but but I used to say, long ago when I came as a kid, that the US is simultaneously the best and the worst country in the world. It's a funny mix, but we shouldn't let ourselves off the hook or close our eyes to something, because the trend of history worldwide, and particularly in the US, is the wrong way. And we should object to some of these things. We should be a conscience to our society. That's the role that Adventists and Christians should play. At the moment, instead, an awful lot of Adventists are gung-ho to get involved with the social gospel. And forgetting what Ellen White said. She gave very good counsel to Adventists. She said there are some things that are good, but others can do them because they are not present truth. We're to be focused on giving a message for the times. Now, I'm not against ADRA. We should support ADRA, particularly at a time like this. But, see things for what they are. We cannot give our way out of poverty. Adventists can't buy the world into riches, right? Jesus said, the poor you have with you always. So we need to do what we can within those sort of resources, but our main emphasis should be on warning the world about what's coming and saying that a better world is coming, you can be part of it. But rather than saying, this is the greatest country, make it great again, and do this, keep everyone out, I'm caricaturing it, but that's not a thing that Adventists in isolation should be part of. Anyone that's read US history knows that it's had different waves of jingoism. And there are very unfortunate aspects of the history. The detention of the Japanese, the expulsion acts against the Chinese. It's very sad stuff. Not to mention just the swallowing up of most of the Spanish Empire. History is what it is. But the Bible is what it is, and we should be enlisted on God's army and proclaiming His principles. And no matter how good a country is, and we're lucky this is largely a good country, don't let that become your agenda. We've been spoiled, I think, more than any country in the US by it being a fairly benign country day in, day out for us. But it's not benign for its opposition. And like every system, it's worldly oriented. It's not oriented about establishing God's kingdom. It can't be. Ellen White also warns, and I'll finish with this and then another question. She also warns that we should be careful that Paul's, I think, rather servile comments about Rome and the leaders doing, that they hold the sword in God's name, that will be used at the end of time to bring people in line to support whatever any country does. And obviously in this country, this one. A country is only acting in support of God when its laws uphold the principles that stand for God's kingdom. And if it enters into telling you what you should do on conscience matters, it's wrong. That's simple. Anyhow, any other comments? Yeah, and then behind. Sorry. Talk about what? No. Well, that's a matter of conscience, but certainly as a citizen, I don't think the church would be responsible to say you shouldn't vote or you shouldn't support a country. But, Ellen White talks a lot about, what responsibility you share if you vote for someone, so you should. But what sort of developed with many Christians, I hope not Adventists, if this one person, say, is against abortion, then they'll back them, even if they're a child molester and whatever on the side. You need to look at the overall picture of someone. And my view is, and I've had a fair contact with politicians, is in national politics, at least in the US, they're sort of like used car salesmen. You're not going to find too many saints among these guys. The whole process, there's the political parties are admittedly falling apart since the last election a bit, but their control of candidates is a little bit like mafia. In fact, there's a classic statement of Truman. Between meetings, I keep forgetting to find out his city he came from, but he was from Missouri, wasn't he? But the city he came from, he was put into office by a fellow named Pendergrast, a mafia boss. And Truman was quoted once as saying to a fellow legislator, he says, just because I was put into office by a mafia boss doesn't mean I can't be an honest politician. And I think it sort of answers itself. He's a compromised person. And there's an awful lot of them like that. And even, just think of Ben Carson, our Adventist favourite of yore. I think he's a nice guy. But think about what he had to run the gauntlet. First thing, he said something on his moral position on homosexuality. Then he had to apologise and eat dirt for the gay lobby. He couldn't have got into office holding a consistent moral view against the whole gay lifestyle movement. And it just goes on and on. You have to lie and mislead people and then say the opposite to another group to get in. You have to promise things to political benefactors, and you're beholden to them. It's become a very morally fraught situation. And yes, you as a citizen, you're entitled and required to make judgments when you vote on these people. But, it's your choice not to, but the church should never tell you what to do. I don't think so. Ellen White did say something very curious, though. She said on temperance, again, it's very important to us. She said the temperance issue is so important that if necessary, you should vote on the Sabbath on a temperance issue. So you follow your conscience on these things. If you're reading God's word, if you're reaching toward Him and clearing your conscience, and then you honestly make a judgment, even if it turns out to be wrong, God's not going to damn you for it, but He will if you don't look at it responsibly. And it would be very irresponsible for the church, like the medieval church, to say, or the religious right, here's your voting list, vote for this person, not for that person. It's horrible. Yes, sorry, the next.
When the Sunday law is passed, what will the breakdown of our religious liberties look like? Where will they start?
Well, put it another way. What do you think lies ahead of us before the Sunday law? Jesus laid out some things, and earthquakes and fires and all the rest. He says, but all of this is just the beginning of the birth pangs. He says, then they will deliver you up. From my understanding, Pastor, help me, I don't know of anything else between here and now and the Sunday law itself, or the introduction of it at all. We've clearly had a sifting time in the church.
Let me add that very point of question, by the way. It went under the radar. I believe it's June 8th. The federal government, if I'm not mistaken, reinstated the capital punishment.
Yes.
And it went without saying. It was and it was underneath the rules, but that has been reactivated again. And it's been years, decades if I'm not mistaken, that we have been against it. And lo and behold, it was introduced and made no news whatsoever on one newscast briefing. That's it. I said, and I made a note of it. This is interesting to me. No one is realizing that this is just another step.
There's many things you can draw a matrix, a threat matrix, if you like to use the military's thing, and taken together, it's just very bad. Like, for instance, in military appropriations bills, or even before I say that, there's a law of the land that the military can't be used against the population. But in military appropriations bills, several years ago, there were a couple of them in a row that stated very clearly that the military are to operate throughout the entire world, even the homeland. And I remember one of the generals being all excited. He says, the whole world has become a free fire zone. It means they kill at will. And then it's specified in one of them, McCain, I'm not as down on him as the president is, but McCain added in one of the bills that says specifically that they can operate against US citizens. So all of these are bad. Then, from the Iraq War anti-terrorism time, it was stated that if the president designates you as an enemy combatant, and it's been done on citizens already, you have no legal protection whatsoever. You can be killed on sight. Every day before we moved, the NAD's moved recently, you probably don't know, but when I was working physically at the General Conference building, I used to drive on my way to work past a mosque about 2 miles away. One of the imams there was Alawaki, an American cleric, probably a very bad guy. What I mean is theologically, I wouldn't wanted to talk to him. But he was online buzzing about stuff from the Quran and that I think any Christian would have found objectionable. But he's an American citizen, subject to legal process. he went to Yemen on a visit. He was never a soldier or a fighter or a terrorist in an active sense whatsoever. But he went to Yemen, and they just put him on the hit list, and he was taking a taxi for rationality. You and I could say they became pagan. But then he says this. He gave 3 reasons as to why Christianity could become violent again. And the second and third reasons was sort of silly because they were tied up to his hatred of secularism. His first reason made my blood run cold. He said, the reformers, he means Luther and Calvin and the others, the reformers, by their insistence on sola scriptura, exposed Christianity again to violence. So don't be under any illusion. The Catholic Church and the government more and more are seeing anyone that's Bible only, this is my rule, you are dangerous. And the Catholic idea, which I hope we never get to, is that it's a combination of the Church Fathers and religious precedent and the Bible. But I hope you don't do something just because Ted Wilson tells you to do it. You're not an Adventist because Ted Wilson thunders from on high, not that he thunders. No, but we are fundamentalists and extremists by the definition that's being established. And already the precedent and even some of the laws are very hard on such people. And Hollywood's not always in the prophecy business, but think of some of the stuff that Hollywood's coming out with. There's Inception, the idea that a future world will see the potential for a crime within you and arrest you ahead of you committing the crime. That's where we are with extremists and fundamentalists. By definition, a radical Muslim will blow himself up, so you can't wait till he's done the crime. You stop him first. So you're dealing with potential. And there's plenty of understanding already. The military and intelligence services in the US are troubled that way. Like even as far back as 2000. God saved us all, I think, from the Y2K computer chaos. But building up to that, they expected the worst. And the FBI, rather, had a task force to deal with this. You know what they called it? Project Megiddo. And then I've read the stuff on it, and they gave a profile on the people that were most to be feared and to watch out for. You know what was top of the list? It says anybody that believes in a literal and imminent return of Jesus Christ. Now, I don't think for 1 second that they were thinking directly of Adventists, but we answer to that. So the days are not far away when we will come under the net that's already being drawn against dissidents and nonconformists and people that have as one of the kings said about the prophet, I don't like him because he says things about me that are not good. And we're to give a warning message? It's already almost too late to give it without consequences. You realize that? And again, Ellen White says we'll have to do these things that we fail to do in a time of great crisis. You had a question on this? It's safe to say what? Well, we've always believed that, and of course Revelation says that they will compel people to a certain behaviour under pain of death. Ellen White says that it's Sunday. I think so, but remember on religious liberty, any time a government starts threatening you on matters of conscience, you know that this is antithetical to religious liberty, whenever there's compulsion involved. So given the times we're living in, when we see dominant religious forces allying with government in this apocalyptic way and starting to put the squeeze on you, that's the final test. And I think there's a good chance, given what I told you about the Pope's environmental document, that it will involve a day of rest. It's sort of logical. That's the biggest sign of conformity to church commands, that you come together for worship when they say. You know, I've got an interesting book at home dating from about religious life in John Bunyan's time and in his area. It documents all the fines and prohibitions against people on church service. They fined one person for keeping to their bed on Sunday. Even the village clerk was fined for singing out of tune in church. So all of these laws about forcing you to come and worship and to worship as they say and you know, prim and proper, we've been there before. These become litmus tests of loyalty, both to the state and to the church, very easily. And we're in the strangest mix. Like I read an article not long ago from Afghanistan on how we were battling the Taliban. We were about to make peace with them. Even the day they bombed like 30, 40 people in Kabul, we were starting peace negotiations. Now I'm forgot the story that I was going to say. In Afghanistan, the US military chaplain gave the men a really rousing talk on what they were doing. And so they whooped and hollered and they headed off to kill Taliban, and they had written on their truck, "Jesus killed Muhammad." It's a very easy shortcut for people that don't know religion and just respond to the edict of the state. In this case, the chaplain is a government representative in essence. Here you got a perverted, violent form of religious activity, not unlike the Crusades. There was a hand over here. Oh, you do? Sorry. Not officially. I've gotten involved in this. You recording this? No, I know a lot about these things. A lot of it I know because as I've told Ted Wilson once, I mean, I'm not necessarily saying I'm his good friend or anything, but he and I were in the same high school class. His dad and my dad were working together. So I've told him, I said, we're sort of children of the church. So I've been around it forever. And I can remember years ago, Bert Beach, who's still alive and a nice guy. We honoured him at our Liberty dinner recently. I like Bert, but you know, if he'd been allowed, I remember my father come and tell him, Bert Beach came to the GC wanting permission to join the World Council of Churches. But he wasn't allowed, and after the church decided that, which was consistent with our view, it wouldn't have really mattered what Bert had done. And to this day, he gets very scared whenever someone mentions medals. He gave a medal to one of the popes, which was a foolish act, but hardly any compromise. I've heard someone talk about things like that as door prizes. He met the Pope and he gave him a medal. And the present Religious Liberty Director at the General Conference, you can go online and there's very embarrassing pictures of him, you know, shaking the hand of the Pope, but the Pope's pretty much up his arm. You know, these are unfortunate. But it doesn't really matter what these individual people do. Our church position cannot be changed because it's so intertwined with our prophecy. We're not part of the second ecumenical movement. We know where it will go. And our Religious Liberty Department is always warning against entanglements with church authorities and state authorities and state aid. We're always against that. I don't know what you're seeing online, but you'll see a lot of crazy stuff. But we have not compromised. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you it's not official, but I got it from the top guy. The last time I talked to Ted Wilson, he says, Diop will not meet with the Pope anymore. But I need to tell you why he met with the Pope. It was not good, but it wasn't our church's doing. Bert Beach first, then John Gratz after him, and he's now retired, and now Diop. They've been elected by their fellow religious leaders of different denominations to be Secretary General of the Christian World Alliance, which is not the World Council of Churches, but it's a brotherly collection of churches. But I believe, and this is why I went and talked to Ted, I believe that more and more the Christian World Alliance is functioning as the World Council of Churches. World Council of Churches is not the main game in town anymore. The move, if you really think about what you've seen in the media and what the Pope says and that, I don't think they're necessarily aiming to have one single church body. What they're now aiming is for the Pope to be chairman of the board of all the religious activities. So it's a different sort of ecumenism. Yes, exactly. Oh, no, it amounts to the same thing. But we've got our guard up against the wrong aspect, as though it's going to be formal joining of the different churches. The closest we've seen of it, well, even closer, what you haven't heard, in Australia when I was there in the 70s, about 4 churches actually physically joined together legally and in the different church communities and formed the Uniting Church. And I thought that was going to be the model till the end of time. And I remember very clearly at that point, the then Archbishop of Canterbury, I think it was Ramsay, came to Australia, and he was asked about this, and he says, about church unity, and he says, the theologians, they argue about this sort of stuff. He says, but the real unity happens when the churches get together for afternoon tea. You've got to understand the English mentality. For afternoon tea, he says, and socialise. That's it. He says, so you should join together and we'll all be one organisation. And he says, we can work these doctrinal things out later. And the interviewer, to his credit, reporter, he said, but what if afterwards you can't work it out? What can happen then? And I'll never forget his response. His eyes narrowed, and he says, it's like a diseased part of the body. Then it must be cut off and destroyed. So there's a hard edge to what they're doing, but it's not one organisation anymore. Now it's a coalition. And the Pope is courting the Muslims. And I don't personally think there's going to be anything like a structural unity, but he's at least trying to denature the Muslim world, but a little bit harder because they don't have a Pope. The most you can say about Islam is each country has a centre of influence for its version of Islam. But the attempt is to sort of bring all together in a synchronistic sort of a whole. And again, this Pope's document on the environment would predicate everyone speaking together and working as a human community to honour God and to protect his creation. Has an appeal, there's logic to it, but we have to call foul when people are being forced against their will and against their conscience to do certain things and to deny parts of their faith. That's the aspect that we object to. Here I can talk about Rome and what they're saying, but Rome has every right to exist and say whatever they want. It's important to us because we know prophecy and we know what's at stake, the issue of conscience. And by the way, I hope you didn't get the idea. I don't think Roman Catholics individually are necessarily worse human beings or even Christians than we are. There's some wonderful Christians I've come across. Even Dolan struck me as a nice guy. But, everybody has to face at some point a matter of conscience. And for them, it might be when they apply force, and they have to think it through as, am I doing the right thing? And, if you know to do sin, it is sin for you. But it's hardly impossible to be saved while being a Roman Catholic any more than a Baptist or an Adventist even. Yeah.
At this point, because it seems to me, maybe just to me, that they are very protected lately, not only in the United States but also in Europe. They can do almost anything they want and they're covered. So I want to know if I'm just paranoid or what is the truth in that.
Well, I have a strong view on Islam because my father had a lot of dealings with Islam, and even when I was in college I got to talk to a lot of these leaders, imams and political leaders. And I've read the Quran a few times, which puts me at least twice ahead of most people. The public discussion of Islam is amazing. I can tell that it's rare to find anyone that's even cracked the book. Don't really know anything. Like the Muslim imams get up all the time and say Islam is a religion of peace, and that's a lie right out of the gate. Islam doesn't mean peace, it means submission. And that's the dynamic. The Quran can keep you up at night if you read it. Not that every single thing in it is bad, but like I'll tell you one thing which should inoculate you against Islam theologically. There's a saying in Surah 5, which is like chapter 5, that's part of a long sequence discussing Jesus in relation to the Father. And it's important enough for Muslims that they've inscribed it inside the roof of the Dome of the Rock. And this is it in English. And they hate you to use English because it's given in Arabic, the language of heaven. You understand that? That Gabriel spoke Arabic supposedly to Muhammad. So it's not a matter of translation. That is heaven. But it says this: they do blaspheme who say that Jesus is the Son of God. God has no son. Now, what does Paul say about the Antichrist? Who is the Antichrist? But he that denies that God has come in the flesh, or that Jesus is the Son of God. I mean, it's a deception. And it goes on. I mean, it's just magnified differences. Like even the rebellion in heaven in the Quran. It's Satan rebelled because man was created higher than the angels. That's a huge difference. The Bible says we're created a little lower than the angels. And we know that the intent of the 144,000 in particular was to replace some of the angels. No, the Western world is afraid of Islam, I believe. It's obvious. They don't know what to do with it. And the best I can make out of it is I believe that Islam is functioning today the same way that it did in Luther's time. Europe was under mortal threat from Islam by way of Turkey, but the Turkish Empire was threatening Europe. There was something like 400 major invasions over about 60, 70 years. Vienna was besieged, nearly fell. Early in the whole process, France came under threat, and Charles Martel, the hammer, defeated them with a great victory. Of course, Spain did fall, and it took several hundred years for the reconquest of Spain, which has everything to do with the Spanish Inquisition, right? All history just meshes together. So the shared fear of invasion was something else in Europe. Today, there is clearly a fear of Islamic terrorism, and I think it's functioning the same way. It's causing Christianity to retrench, to become more extreme in dealing with the issues, and to demand greater fidelity to what is defined as politically and religiously as Western, Christian, whatever. I don't myself think Islam will conquer the West, nor do I can't see any dynamic that they could come into an open, broad alliance with Christianity. It's just antithetical to them. But it's clearly the dynamic driving last day events. And most importantly, there's a lot of Adventist history we seem to have conveniently forgotten. But Uriah Smith has a whole chapter on Islam in prophecy. And Ellen White endorsed this view, which the major part of it was held by Josiah Litch, that holds that Islam is the sixth trumpet, is the trumpet of Revelation 9. It's these beings with long hair like women and the stings, and it's pretty apocalyptic. A third of mankind die with this scourge. And our church held definitively this was Islam. And we'll see how it works out. But I mean, I don't see how we can easily retreat from such an apocalyptic view of the role of Islam at the end of time. You think we need to finish? No, Oh, okay. Any other? We can go a little bit longer. Any other questions? Well, let me ask you a leading question. Do you listen to Walter Weith's stuff? Yeah. I don't believe in his view. He claims that Islam is a stalking horse created by Jesuits. And that's giving way too much power to Rome. They may have, as they are now, tried to steer Islam to their own ends, but their track record is not very good. It's a largely uncontrollable organization. All he gets to feed his view is that we know, it's a plain matter of history, that if Muhammad existed, I say that advisedly, it's not easy to prove he existed. The story is that he knew some Jews in his hometown, and he came under the influence of Catholic priests. But to summarize Islam's view of Catholicism, when the Muslim Turks were moving up into Europe, the instructions from the Caliph were very plain, that consistent with what the Quran says, that they were to be merciful to the people of the book. Any Christian that was a Bible-believing and following Christian, but to kill without mercy anybody that wore the tonsure. You know, the monks, I mean, I'm getting one too, but, you know, I don't know how you can spin that as if this is being a front for the Catholic Church. They hate the Catholic Church. And what also is feeding into current dynamic, and watch it, there's a great schism that's not been healed yet between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church, which was almost totally over the authority of the Pope, him claiming dominance, and over issues of the Trinity. And I think that's influencing current events in crazy ways too. I'm getting into a complicated thing, but just think for a minute. Why has Russia chosen to put all their cards on the table with Syria? There's little to gain from it, but we've backed off. They actually went in there where we were threatening to shoot down their planes and to almost any sort of war against them. Russia came into Syria and has done whatever it takes, because they claim they're fighting a holy war against terrorism. A little before that, Putin stood shoulder to shoulder with I'm trying to think what they call the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church, Kirill is his name. I think it's Kirill. They stood shoulder to shoulder in Russia before the media and formally announced a joint holy war by Russia and the Eastern Orthodox Church against terrorism. And they have determined that it's just not going to go any further. And people forget there's been subway bombings in Russia. There were like 400 kids killed by Chechnyan Muslim guerrillas in a school. There's just been a litany of things. And Russia borders a lot of Muslim areas. They've decided to go for broke against Islamic terrorism. So I think it's the engine driving last day events. Or a major engine. I shouldn't say it's the only engine. But again, why should it be immaterial for Adventists when we once held, and have never that I know of, formally repudiated Uriah Smith's view? Hard, because Ellen White confirmed Josiah Litch's underlying prophecy that Islam is that force named in Revelation. So food for thought. Any other questions? I probably started more than I've finished with these comments, but I want people to be thinking. Well, he's willing to do anything. Remember, his successor went to the Blue, after his speech where he insulted them, they say, and they rioted, he went to Istanbul and prayed in the Blue Mosque in the niche that faces toward Mecca. I mean, that's a pretty big compromise by Rome. They're willing to do whatever it takes to get on side, but they haven't succeeded yet. And how they will succeed is beyond me. There is no Pope of the Islamic world. In fact, what we're seeing now, and I wish the US had spotted it earlier, the Islamic world is irretrievably fractured between Sunnis and Shiites. And you know what it's over, don't you? They hardly ever explain it for you. Muhammad was the warlord or the imam of the growing Islamic movement. When he died, he indicated that he wanted his friend Abu Bakr to be the successor. But his son-in-law Ali had backers. And so Ali, they were the Shiites, and Abu Bakr became the Sunni. That's it. It's not theology. It's a succession question. Most of the Islamic world is Sunni, but the Sunnis are the radicals. The Sunnis are based in Saudi Arabia, where they've embraced the most rigid form of Wahhabist, they call it. It's basically right-wing conservative Islam that's even against moderate Muslims. And the Shiites are most exemplified by Iran. And why we are backing, why we're attacking Shiite Iran is beyond me. We can use Iran to heal the growing Sunni powers, but not going to happen. But I've lived long enough, like some of you, to see the world turn on its axis. I remember when I came to the US, there used to be regular newspaper articles in the US extolling Iran as the most wonderful country in the world. They were our bulwark of freedom. We'd armed them to the teeth. They were going to protect us. And now they're the evil empire. Yeah. Well, I read Great Controversy, and I can't prove this, but nearly always Ellen White says, when she talks about the Sunday law, she says it goes out throughout Christendom. Uses that term over and over again, Christendom. And I think it's logical. What test for a non-Christian is the Sunday law? If you're a Muslim or a Hindu, there's no test on a Sunday law. You're not keeping a Christian day anyway. You're not even reaching toward that. It might, by outside observation, make them think about something, but it's not a test for them. All that I think, there's a good chance that if a Sunday law is passed, at least in the early stages in the US, they probably will give an exemption to the Jews because they're not Christians. This is a Christian law. And I can't imagine that, at least initially, Muslims would come under a great threat. I know Idi Amin expelled all of the Asians from Uganda, but there's 30 million Muslims, as I remember, in the US. That's not to be done lightly. You could have a civil war if you tackle them head on. I don't know. Adventism never claims to have definitive answers to every development in the world, but the general principles, I think, are quite plain. And what we should be clear on, Islam is at the very least an antagonist to Christianity, and I think you can make a good case that it's a deeply satanic movement at root. It's a cult-like thing. The more like I say, I've met Muslims that are nice. I don't hate Muslims on sight, but I've talked to imams. I've read the Quran. And more than that, again, people think they just read the Quran. They have 6,000 hadith. The Quran, I'll tell you what the Quran is. This is supposedly the testimonies, verbal testimonies that the angel Gabriel made to Muhammad over several years. Verbal. But as well as that, they have, like what we have in the Bible, the Gospels. They have the stories written about Muhammad and his followers. They have theological works by followers of Muhammad. They have the life of Muhammad. There's at least 2 hadiths that I've read on jihad. Read those and you won't sleep at night, I'm telling you. The Quran's plain enough. Jihad is to kill the infidel, anybody who doesn't believe. The Islamic view is a little bit nuanced. They expect you to, with the arrogance of their faith, that you will recognize the Prophet and acknowledge him and join with them and fine. But if you resist them, you're to be destroyed. But if you convert, they'll welcome you in. But if you turn from Islam, the Quran's very plain. You're to be eviscerated, killed as bloodily as possible. In Indonesia, where I went a couple of times, they told us a couple of stories that are typical there. The roving bands of Muslims on one occasion, in one story, went to this island that was mostly Christian, and they stormed ashore, and they and the Christian community largely hid up on the top of the mountain, but they grabbed a few people in the village, and they said, "We've come here to convert you to Islam." They said, "When we return, we'll be back in a few weeks, we'll either kill you all if you don't want to become Christians, or we'll have a great party to celebrate your conversion. But the pastor is to die." And up on the mountain, they discussed it, and the pastor recommended that they go down and go along with them, and he died. Islam is brutal at base. They expanded during the long period of expansion through a combination of conquest. That's why the swords in Saudi Arabia and other things. But as well as that, they were traders. So there's no question that they had trade influence where people accepted a message that superficially can sound like Christianity. But by and large, it's a religion that has great intolerance. And whether or not it's the God, I remember what you said before, whether or not it's the God of the Bible, you can dispute that. You know, I'd accept it at face value because they say it's God, but they're not describing him accurately. But, you know, when I've sat down with the imams, they even sort of know that it was an inheritance and a continuation of the moon god in Saudi Arabia. And even on the day they worship, I actually, before I'd read the Quran, I was talking to one imam, and he said to me, he says, the Quran says that the seventh day is the Sabbath. And I said, really? He says, oh, yes. So he showed me the reference, and what it says there is that God's punishment rests on the Jews because they profaned the Sabbath. So I said, how come they don't keep the seventh-day Sabbath? And he says, they were already keeping Friday in the pagan moon worship that existed before Islam, and Muhammad didn't want to trouble them too much. So they know. But it's a very interesting story. But what the underbelly, I think, of Islam that nobody deals with, you can read the theologians or the historians, they know this. Supposedly it was all given to Muhammad verbally, but there's no evidence of a written form of the Quran for about 250 years. One of the caliphs assembled it. And I played the party game where you sit in a circle and you repeat something in someone's ear and it goes around. It's so different when it comes back. I wouldn't put much faith in that. Christianity has a little problem that it's a generation until the Gospels appear. But, we're not going for verbal infallibility. So it's easy to prove Christianity that this is the story that emerges a little while later through these hard copies. But Islam has just got, complicated story from the God speaking or the angel speaking for God, and it doesn't even appear. And then the evidence of Muhammad is iffy to the extreme. Did he really exist? Not sure. It's possible that the caliphs invented him out of a composite. It's a desert religion. It copies Christianity. It's got most of the stories of the Old Testament in it, but obviously Ishmael is the favored son, not Isaac. It's a mockery, I think, by and large. And the contradictions in it are amazing. Like it'll say, and the apostate is to be killed and eviscerated and all the rest, and then it'll say, next sentence, no transition, because Allah is all merciful. But we need to recognize that there's good people there, but they're closed in by their community and their theology. How are you going to go in a hardcore Islamic country? If they listen to you, they'll be persecuted by their neighbors and perhaps killed. Like in Saudi Arabia, there's only one penalty for conversion. It's death. And in most other countries, the fundamentalist countries, the civil penalties could be death, like Pakistan. We have a number of, and there's an Adventist woman, I think, still in jail in Pakistan, just accused of profaning the Prophet. And it doesn't take much. There were two brothers in Pakistan that a peddler came by their neighbourhood selling some sweet drink on a hot day. And so they bought it and then took the glass and started to drink from it. And he complained because they're Christians. And I don't know what they said. They don't have to have said anything. But Christians drank from the same glass as a Muslim. So he went to the imam and said they'd profaned Islam. And they were put on trial for their life. And one of them, as I remember, got 20-some years. That's all it takes. Very hard. Our church has tried, and I think it stopped doing it now, but it tried for a while in a very misguided effort to convert Muslims. We would send, quote, missionaries undercover into Muslim countries, passing themselves off as Muslims, and they would try to get into conversation with the community. And they would come out periodically and say that they had so many people that were meeting, they were Hanafi Christians that had bought into Jesus and the concepts of Christianity, but they didn't know it. And yet if they were told, they'd be killed. It's a very, very sad situation. I think the best we can do is pray that God will somehow open the minds of Islam. But for all this talk you hear now and then, there's almost zero success in converting Islam. The few that are picked up on the periphery are people that were never deeply part of an Islamic culture, and they maybe have become a secularist or something, and then they might end up as an Adventist. But I've just never seen any evidence that you can convert someone from a hardcore Muslim to any form of Christianity. Well, it's a bad way to end, I must admit, so let's have one question that bears on something.
Becoming a Christian
Yeah.
in Islam and God and Allah are not.
Well, I don't think they are. Yeah, yeah. Well, there's some cases, but like I say, you investigate his life and that, you'll find out that it was sort of shaken loose bit by bit. Just in conclusion, let me reiterate what I said, I think, in the sermon. Please understand that our Religious Liberty Department and the Southern Union is prime on this, will defend you in the workplace if you have problems. And if you have any sort of difficulty in your workplace, don't wait till they're threatening you, or worse, you've lost your job. Go immediately. In fact, contact your pastor and he'll bucket brigade it, I'm sure. It'll end up at the union, and if necessary, we'll hire lawyers, or there's lawyers that work pro bono. But there is a mechanism to protect Adventists using available laws. I told you the reality, if it gets legally challenged, it can get difficult. But the overwhelming majority of cases, it's a matter of communication, that on your behalf, sometimes just the pastor with a letter that the union can give to him, but other times the union might take control. But sending a communication to the employer explaining your position, not so much what the church thinks, but what your rights are on a principled stand. And it's worked very well in the past. But also, understand, that's not the only thing we do by any stretch. And that we are talking with other churches. We even talk with Muslims, obviously, a lot. And I've had a Muslim imam on the television program at 3ABN. Admittedly, he was an Ahmadiyya Muslim who were persecuted by Sunnis and Shiites. And we have government relations. We're working, one of our associates now used to be the associate on Liberty magazine. She's working now more directly with government. So we're trying to up our game as the threat or the stakes get higher and higher. So you need to pray. At the end of the day, that's the most important thing you can do. And then there's the present realities. We need money, offerings to support what we're doing. But money without prayers won't do much either. So we all need to be part of this effort, because these are interesting times, dangerous times, and yet at the same time, like I think it was my first sermon when I started with Liberty Magazine. I used The Tale of Two Cities as my opening illustration. I don't know if you've ever read that Dickens book. It was written about the times of the French Revolution, which was cataclysmic for Europe, and more so for France in particular. But it starts by saying it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. On some levels, things have never been freer. We've never had as much ease, the things that consumer society counts as ease, and that we're not stressed. But be careful, because some people, some elements of society might be right in the middle of a persecution. We need to be sensitive. And remember, Germany's always a great thing to refer back to. You know, in Germany in World War II, people that weren't being bombed by the Allies, some of them lived right next door to the death camps, and they claim they didn't know. Don't know, but it might have been possible, because life seemed unnaturally normal for them, because they chose not to ask questions or to look too closely at things around them. And a lot of our modern life's like that. There's an apparent ease. And Ellen White actually said in her lifetime, she said, far too many Seventh-day Adventists think too favourably of the present time. There's some things to be grateful for the Lord. We always pray, thank you for freedom. We still have it. It's not gone in the sense that state will allow it. Remember, it comes from God. But we're not greatly impeded. But we could. For example, I'll conclude on this. Our Religious Liberty Department is still in panic, I think not warranted right now. But coming up to the last election, laws in various states, particularly in California, were about to require our schools to build and provide gay student accommodation, even for married gay couples, and really forcing them to hire and not able to fire people of that lifestyle. And if we didn't do that, we would lose not only our money but our accreditation, and in essence, schools would cease to be. I don't think that threat is so viable under this administration. They're not going to allow that sort of thing, but they're pushing back in other areas that might be as big a threat to us. Tricky times. So please pray for us. And thank you again for having me here. It's more than time for me to head off.
Yes,
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. A couple of words as we take about another 15 or 20 minutes, so go ahead and stretch if you'd like to.
No.
Don't throw the shoes at me now, come on. No, are you picking me up good enough there? I want this on tape as well. Are you picking me up good enough, or do you need to use this?
You should probably use that.
I should? May I?
Yeah.
Okay.
The stream.
Yeah, because it's streaming. Now this will be obviously for obvious reasons. Many people were asking, and Elder Steed, I want to thank you again for standing behind this. There are a few things that I want to contextualize that were mentioned here. They were asked, or a question was asked: is our church in the ecumenical movement? And I want to thank Elder Steed for speaking the way he did. I want to point to a few things. I asked a very poignant question at the beginning purposely. I wanted to see his take from the inside. We are not called to be faithful to our church. Hold on, you heard me. We are called to be faithful to the truth as we know it in Jesus. There may be individuals within our organization that have their understanding or misunderstanding of what that truth might be. Irregardless of that, we are called to be faithful to the truth as it is in Jesus. When we come into this perspective of whether our church is part of this or not, and again, you masterfully took care of it, and I appreciate it. To me, I like to speak openly about it to avoid misunderstandings. What do we do on the ground level here? Because Elder Jackson can be up there, Elder Wilson can be up there. That's immaterial to who I am as a Seventh-day Adventist. Because their responsibility is up there somewhere representing the world, or North America.
But my responsibility before God has nothing to do with Elder Ted Wilson or Elder Jackson. It has everything to do with my circle of influence. So I always bring it down to that level there. What do we do being on the ground level as Seventh-day Adventists when we find ourselves in such a rivaled, riveted time when it comes to religious liberty? Number one, pray. Number two, put your money where your mouth is. You've heard that before, right? Because that's what moves the machinery we live in, to be able to sustain the liberties we still have. I want to remind you that Liberty Magazine goes to over 200,000 government officials, correct me if I'm wrong, close to. The grand majority of it, a bit under almost 200,000 government officials around North America. That's the pinpoint of Liberty Magazine. Why? Because it enlightens them as to a proper understanding of God's worldview. Are you with me? When it comes to this right, this God-given right of religious liberty. Thanks to our church spearheading that, we still hold liberties in this country that otherwise we would not have. I want you to think of that for a minute. Again, that's why it's been great here. I've got more to say, but I won't let you, I won't hold you here. I know you have more questions. Let me entertain the following. Let's be students of the Bible, of Bible prophecy. Let's challenge one another on these issues because we need to keep it in the forefront. This is the reason why I asked the question to begin with. And I asked him the tricky question he failed to answer purposely, and wisely so. Has he seen a shift in his 20 years of an emphasis within the church? And the answer was yes. And you know who's to blame for that? Do you? We are. Help me. We are. Why?
You're working back very well through my points.
Okay, thank you.
Prayer and the
Okay, thank you.
knowledge.
Thank you.
I believe we need to be reading the Bible more,
Mhm.
and then as Adventists, we need to be more aware of what's going on.
And
You say very informed, but generally speaking, Adventists don't seem to know the current events very well.
And that's exactly where we're headed to. Half the things this gentleman mentioned today are food for thought for me and to be digging again. If anything happens on our watch, it's because it happened on our watch. I cannot shift that responsibility on the leaders of the church because if I am not well informed, I will be held liable regardless. I'm reminded Elijah had a moment, and I shared it with my friend Herb, where he felt alone. He felt he was the only one being faithful to what God called him to do. And God reminded him, I have 7,000 that you know not of, that have not bowed their knee today. May we be amongst them. Amen? Amen. Thank you very much, Elder Steed. One more time. Thank you. Thank you, David Koliadko, for making it happen. This we have purposely placed on our website as well. We want to encourage this. Later on, you'll hear more. We need to be studying the times that we're in because Jesus is right around the corner. Amen? And I am anxiously waiting for my Lord to come. I think this world is tired, and so am I, of seeing so many things we cannot control, though we've tried. Let's give it to Jesus. Amen? Let's do that. Why don't you stand with me and let's sing a song that goes hand in hand with that. I want to sing 518, I think it is, Standing on the Promises. My pianist went away, but I think, well, there was a guitar there. Unless there's a pianist in the house, we'll sing it a cappella. Oh, are you a pianist as well, young man? Oh, okay, because I saw that chest coming out, and I said, uh-oh. Oh, thank you so very much. Thank you for reminding me. Yes. That's a classic throw under the bus. Yes. Yes. And she waited till the pedal was to the metal to throw her. Yes. All right. 518, Standing on the Promises. $5.18, Standing on the Promises. It's a real fancy piano. It looked like special cave where things go in. Standing on the promises.
Hold on. Sorry.
Take your time. It's the Sabbath. Don't worry about it. Pray with me. Heavenly Father, we thank you because we can stand on your word, on your promises. You are a faithful God, and we thank you because that faithfulness does not rely on whether we are good or not. It relies on the fact that you are the God that promised to keep his promises, the God of his word. Lord, we pray the forgiveness of our sins, your blessing as we now leave this place, and as we have been challenged today to understand the times that we live in, please give us an extra portion of your Holy Spirit, giving us wisdom so that we may know how to navigate through these tricky times, as Elder Steed said, to be found faithfully standing in our place, sharing the gospel, the eternal gospel, good news in Jesus, and giving the warning and preparation necessary for this time. Lord, may the time that we've spent here be multiplied in blessings to many others who may also know this truth. Take us to our destination as we leave this place, and may your presence always go before us. We pray in Jesus' precious name. Amen. Amen. Thank you. Thank you very much.